The channel. Today we are going to do a special episode because I have some friends on the channel today. I'm going to be talking to the friends from Presby Girls. You may have heard of Presby Cast. Well, there's Presby Girls also. So we're going to talk a little bit about Worshiptainment today. I've asked my friends Sarah and Zoe, who I'll give a chance to introduce themselves in just a moment, to read the book Worshiptainment, the Modern Church's Golden Calf, and maybe just give me some feedback, some critique. So we're going to do that. But real first, let's introduce the principals. We have up here Zoe. Zoe, say hi to the folks.
Hey, y'all. Great to be here, Matt. Thanks so much for having us. I think it's going to be a really fun discussion. And thank you for sending me a copy of Worshiptainment. My name is Zoe Miller. I am married to a wonderful pastor and preacher. His name's Seth Miller, and we are currently at Emmanuel Presbyterian Church, which is the Pacific Northwest Presbytery's newest or second newest church plant in Post Falls, Idaho. And so we're up here in the Northwest, which has less snow than you might imagine. But yeah, that's what we're doing. We're really enjoying it. We're on year one. We just finished up our 1 year anniversary of moving to Idaho. So it's been great.
Now, before we started recording, you told me a really interesting story. And why don't you give us like the 60-second version if you're able to? How did you meet your husband? Because it's kind of a neat story.
So asking me to tell a short story is difficult, but I think that's good because I'm usually not capable of doing it. My husband, Seth, and I met because of our show, Presby Girls. In 2022, we interviewed Rosaria Butterfield, and the episode ended up being pretty widely watched. It was about revoice, sexuality issues, very hot topic in the PCA at the time. Seth, my husband, not my husband at the time, though, he ends up watching the podcast episode, mentioning my name offhand to the associate pastor at his office. He was an assistant at the time. And so him and the associate pastor in the office mentions my name offhand. And then the associate pastor goes to the GRN conference and starts telling everybody that they've got a youth pastor down there at Redeemer that's got a crush on one of the Presby girls. And so because I know so many people in the PCA, I guess, the news ends up getting back to me pretty quick. And someone tells me there's a youth pastor with a crush on me. I think about a guy in skinny jeans and I'm like, probably not going to work. And then the same associate pastor says, hey, you got to meet Seth Miller. He's great. I think you guys really like each other. And then we end up getting set up in a group chat with the three of us on Discord. And when it turns out we're getting along, the other guy finds an excuse to leave. And so we end up taking it from there, and the rest is history. We met in May of 22, met in person for the very first time at the General Assembly in 2022, which is in Birmingham, Alabama, and we exchanged a very awkward handshake over Sarah's child.
So that's my favorite part of the story because people don't think of General Assemblies as being very romantic, but they actually are. So your first date was like new business or something like that in the main business portion of the meeting. That's pretty great.
It was. It really was. And the funniest part of it is that we were texting the whole time about like what's happening. I think we had some sexuality overtures at the 2022 General Assembly that ended up being there was some hot debate about that. And O. Palmer Robertson gave a really good 5-minute speech.
I remember that. Classic. Best moment of the assembly.
Seth ends up going to get water or something, and he comes back and he texts me and he says, Zoe, Dr. Robertson is sitting in my seat. And he was like, I'm not gonna tell him to get up or anything like that. I'm just gonna let him sit there. But he happened to glance down at Dr. Robertson's Bible and he had it open to Romans 1. And he said, I think he's going to get up and speak on the floor, which is amazing because I don't think anybody had heard him speak on the floor for a long time. So that was a fun moment. And then it ended up being an amazing, excellent speech. So it was very fun. I highly recommend your first date being a General Assembly. It's okay. It's okay if it's not. I was just
going to say, like, watch enrollment just swell this year as people come looking for new relationships. Who knows? Now, Sarah, you have several things in common with Zoe because we were talking off the air too just a minute ago, and you also grew up in Africa. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your story as well, real quick?
Well, grow up is a stretch. I think my parents were there for about 5 years. I came back when I was too little to really remember.
Okay.
So they were in Mozambique, and when the civil wars in the 90s broke out, they were on a sort of an agricultural missionary. They're supposed to be taking care and doing this whole farm out of all these acres. And then when everybody's burning and shooting and ravaging, that kind of fell through the cracks. So then they came home. But I grew up in a tiny little town in southeastern North Carolina, which I know is 3 directions, but we'll figure it out. Very close to Myrtle Beach, right above the South Carolina border. And went to Grove City College, met my husband, Sean Morris. He's a associate pastor here in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which is just outside of Knoxville. And we've got 4 kids, and I don't know, life is busy. So
Yes,
that's pretty much it.
Praise God. That is awesome. So just making full connection here. Both Sarah and Zoe are married to Presbyterian pastors in the PCA. Both of them spent some time, at least in Africa. Zoe, I guess we didn't really mention the fact that you had extended period of time of your young childhood or young adolescence in Uganda. So you both have Africa connections, both married to PCA pastors, and you do this podcast called Presby Girls. So tell us real quick about what your podcast is, how often it airs, and what are some of the themes that you guys discuss.
We're both laughing because we're really bad about how often it airs. It just kind of life gets in the way. And podcasting for us is, well, if I can get all of my chores done and get the kids down and dinner cleaned up and the kitchen done and everybody's asleep, then I can podcast. And usually I just fall asleep because I'm old. So we have to actually get our act together. But I would say that Presby Girls started as 2 women who, even though we're 13 years apart, kind of found each other and realized we were kindred spirits. And we were both excited about the same things, both frustrated by the same things. Eventually ended up both marrying PCA pastors, which is hilarious.
So you knew each other before you were married to pastor. Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, before Zoe was married at least. And so, we try to on Presby Girls. We don't want to be just the female version of Presbycast, because we're not even going to try to touch we'll label it as grandeur, but I can't think of another word.
Majesty, maybe?
Renown? Personality disorder, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah. But we try to do things that, maybe sometimes that not necessarily interest the men, but more taking simple things and bringing them down to, okay, what does the layperson in the pew, the pastor's wife, the person who is not familiar with all of the lingo and the special phrases and the way people double speak about certain topics, what's actually going on, and maybe trying to, at least at this point, trying to broach more evergreen topics instead of always fighting fire, always responding to the latest upheaval. I mean, you don't want to be dictated by the tyranny of the urgent. So we're trying to move in that direction a little bit.
Now, Zoe, what's the relationship between Presby Girls and Presbycast? Is that distributed on the same channel, or is it 2 separate feeds that you would subscribe to? How does that work?
Yeah, so Presby Girls is hosted exclusively by Presbycast. Sarah and I were actually introduced by Brad Isbell in the first place to start doing the show. So it's very much a creation of Presbycast, even though we have a different kind of brand going on, but it's hosted in the same place. All you have to do is search Presbycast or even Presby Girls on YouTube, and it's under the Presbycast YouTube channel. So
the first time we met was on that Presbycast during GA.
Yeah, that's right.
When in St. Louis. Yeah, it was the first time we met, and Brad put us together on there, and then later put us together again. So Brad is also an RE at my church. So there's a connection there.
That's right. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Every time you say that, I'm like, oh yeah, I guess I did definitely know that.
Yeah, he has the misfortune of dealing with me twice a week, so it's
right. I think it's interesting that there's a female Presbyterian themed podcast, because although there are a few podcasts that are led by women hosts, not too many. In fact, my channel gets 83% male viewers. And so the number of female viewers that I have on my channel is actually really, really quite small.
That's interesting, because I feel like the proportions for our show are quite similar, mostly because of who hosts the show, and also because we're kind of nerdy and we talk about weird, obscure stuff sometimes. We try to distill it down to a normal level, because we know that not everybody cares about the same stuff the way that we do. It's just, not everybody's going to meet their husband at General Assembly, and that's okay. I think people have really, this is just a personal thing, but I think people have really kind of shun the concept of the ordinary as something that's good. And I think that's amazing. It is really wonderful to be an ordinary person. Where was I going with that? What was the context? This happens to me a lot, I'm afraid. I'm really sorry about that.
We're just talking about the percentage of female viewers that I have is notably small. So it's interesting that you would have a Presbyterian themed female podcast.
I think our female viewership is a little bit better as far as the numbers there. But I mean, another thing is just how encouraging is it as a pastor or as a ruling elder to listen to normal people or just normal women saying the same things that you're saying. I mean, that's got to be encouraging, knowing, okay, it's not just, your niche group of buddies that know what's going on at General Assembly. You've got people in the pews, regular people in the pews who are like, yes, you should be irritated about this. You should be fighting for this. Thank you for putting in the time at Presbytery to run through this paperwork or to push this. We're actually grateful. And so, sometimes it's just because the men are more online and the women are dealing with kids and households and fall asleep before they can ever log on to anything. But, a lot of it is just encouraging. You guys are doing what you should be doing. Keep at it.
Well, I gave you a couple of copies of my book, Worshiptainment, just for your feedback and consideration. So I was wondering, did you have a chance to read it? And if so, what are some of your off-the-cuff responses to the book?
So I did have a chance. Yeah. Okay, sure. So I did have a chance to read through it. I need to read through it again because I am preparing a review that's going to go on the Aquila Report sometime soon. I really like the topic of worshiptainment. It's something that we've actually talked about a decent amount on our show. I think the first 2 installments of our show are 10 ways that pastors can encourage the women in their congregation. And the bulk of that was actually focused on worship. We talked about worship a lot. And I think the reason why is because the way in which the pastor and the elders orchestrate the worship actually says a lot about how they intend to feed their congregants. It's kind of an obscure topic that you would think, how can you encourage your congregation by doing certain things in worship? Well, you definitely can. And so this book is really accessible, especially if you've never heard of the regulative principle before. It's definitely plain. Like, you're not writing something that appears to be like really evangelical. Like, it doesn't have like a nice minimalistic book cover, which I actually like. You're not. It's plain on its face about what the book is. You are lobbying for the regulative principle. You're very frank about that, but you just draw out all these examples of errors in modern culture. Errors in modern culture that just get away from the original designs that God has for worship. And you're not trying to be nuanced about it. And nuance is a word that gets a lot of airtime, but not a lot of good airtime. And I really like how accessible it is. But it's like, you're clear. Like, I like the regulative principle. I think it protects us from a lot of bad errors in worship. And I really do enjoy the book.
Thanks. How about you, Sarah? Any, and you can hit me, with any critiques too. That's totally fine. What was your first blush take?
First blush, I thought, again, really basic, accessible. My favorite chapter was towards the end, which is funny because when you think about worshiptainment, you think, okay, this guy is going to be harping on the regulative principle of worship. I like how you admitted that, I might be Presbyterian, old and traditional and stuffy or whatever. You're like, I was like, going to go ahead and say that. And I'm like, yeah, okay. Yeah, we're not trying to pull the wool over anybody's eyes. But towards one of the last chapters, when you talked about the rise of, the mega pastor, the Zoe and I have a term for it. It's the important men of the denomination that always get sort of the airtime. And that's something that's really resonating with me right now. And I appreciated that you brought it up in your book about worship and how we should lead worship, because so often, even if you get your music right, even if you get your liturgy right, even if you have confession and you have prayer and you have, everything that's supposed to be there, if you are centered around one guy and the whole church is just modeled around this one personality, you've put a timestamp on your entire church's ministry.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's so debilitating. And then once that
Mhm.
guy takes another job,
Mhm.
or he, ages out or
Disgraces himself
dies, or,
perhaps with a ministry failure, that can
yeah.
happen too.
Yeah, then you have this, complete identity crisis as a church of
Mhm.
what do we do? Where do we go from here? Because they've built their identity around this larger than life personality rather than around the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And it is so important for men to not get in the way of the Bible. I mean, you shouldn't make the Bible boring. You shouldn't
Mhm.
add to it, but don't get in the way of it. Just preach it. Stop,
Mhm.
and being married to a pastor. That expectation that if you reach a certain size as a church, as a congregation, then you should be able to look for, a really good guy, a really polished guy, a guy, it's almost like even in the PCA, we have this unsaid expectation that the larger your churches get, the more well-known and celebrity-ish your pastor
Yeah.
should be.
Right.
And, I'm not trying to be mean about this. I'm not trying to step on any toes. But as a pastor's wife, the idea that a man can be gifted in every single area, kind of like the celebrity pastors tend to want you to believe that they are,
Mhm.
is impossible. No pastor is gifted in every area. He's going to have strengths. He's going to have weaknesses. And these celebrity guys have weaknesses too. They just have
Oh,
a
yeah.
whole bunch of people, covering for it. Or like you
Sure.
said, there's no accountability. So you don't know their weaknesses until it comes out in flaming dumpster fire.
Yeah. Mhm.
So that point really resonated with me. I appreciated it.
Now, Sarah, you grew up in a different tradition besides Presbyterianism, which is different from Zoe. We'll come back to you in just a second, Zoe, because you were born and raised Presbyterian, basically. Sarah, have you seen some of the kind of crazy worship phenomena that I describe in the book? Or what would be some examples, if any, of like kind of poor performative, over the top fog machines and laser lights type experiences in worship that you've experienced? Have you seen anything like that, or not really?
Yeah, I've been to a few of the fog and laser shows. Either not really in college, but just around. I grew up in a very rural area, so the kind of, I don't know, worship sins that were committed were a little bit more folksy. So
Okay.
some of the things that I can remember were, really, really sweet people, but we would have the manger scene up about a few
Mhm.
weeks before Christmas,
Mhm.
and it would be on the communion table up in front. It'd be this, gorgeous hand painted set, and they were trying to raise money for a specific ministry. And so however much money you would raise, another piece would get put in the nativity
Oh,
scene.
okay.
Now, if you can imagine where this is going, you had
Yeah.
I think we had to get up to like $2,000. Otherwise, the constant threat every Christmas season was baby Jesus might not end up in the
He might
manger
not
if we
come.
don't
He might not
reach
come this year.
2,000.
That is
And
hilarious.
I don't even want to laugh at it because, oh my goodness, this lady was so sweet. And it was hand painted by everybody's grandchildren.
Yeah.
So you have all of the sentimental attachments to stuff, but you have a nightmare of just a headache.
Right.
One of the things that,
So you could be, sorry to interrupt, you could be like shepherd level giving, angel level giving, there's Mary level giving.
It's like a brilliant multi-level marketing scheme right
It
there.
is.
They had
Yeah, that's
no
great.
idea.
Yeah.
But I mean, they were sweet people. They didn't really know any better, and nobody had ever taught them anything. And so it's just
Mhm.
like, how do you unravel that mess without completely, at that point, would just be splitting the church apart? I mean, it would have been an intense brouhaha. But I mean, one of the things that when we were at a church in Roanoke, the senior pastor there tried to take down some second commandment violations in the paintings. I think there was a Road to Emmaus and a couple other ones. And he was like, they've hung on the church for 50, 60 years. Maybe we should just put them in a closet. Well, they'll just, gracefully disappear. And I mean, it was like World War III had blown up, and it was, Pastor, you stick to preaching, don't you stick to meddling. And
oh man, yeah.
so
we
not the
tried
big fogs, but
yeah, that's an important one though. And we do touch on that a little bit in the book.
Yeah.
Second commandment violations. We tried to take down a few in my church in Florida, just a couple at a time. And that was going to be a no-go for a lot of people. And unfortunately that sanctuary had like the whole life of Jesus story in stained glass windows. I'm not sure who or how they ever decided to put that up in the first place, but I kind of knew, like, I don't think I'm ever going to get this far as reforming this, but
You have
even
to
some of
pick
the
your
smaller
battles.
things. Yeah. Even the classic, Christ portraits, his senior picture that everywhere, every church has that. Just taking that and moving that down was a big ask.
Did you ever have any with the American flags in the sanctuary and that kind of stuff?
I never allowed the American flag to be in the sanctuary at the churches that I was a pastor of, but I will say that controversy has been in every church that I've been a part of. So when it's not there, people have demanded that it is, but usually I've been able to allay that conflict by saying, hey, we have the flag outside the sanctuary. And I've kind of made the rationale that, like, we come here to worship and it's only about the Lord here in the sanctuary, but outside, we display our patriotism with our flag. Our flag gives us the freedom to gather to worship. And so I've kind of made this inside outside theological argument for the flags, but that controversy is in every church, I think. Yeah.
And you get to where, it's really easy for people to pontificate online and say, oh, I never do that. I never allow that, and rant and rave and whatever. Yeah. And then you deal with the actual people and you're thinking, okay, you've got the World War II vet. Sure. Who's like, that flag belongs in the sanctuary. We built this church. I mean, this is American. I mean, how do you even start to argue with that without sounding that? That's why I appreciate it. I think it was in the introduction of your book. You said something to the extent of, a lot of this stems from trying to please personalities, trying to please people, making worship more accessible. And instead of more accessible, what it does is making worship not worship, or it just waters it down so much. But you're constantly trying to appease personalities. Let's see if we can compromise here. Let's see if we can compromise here. And I mean, any pastor who's worth his salt knows that you can't satisfy everybody, but at the same time, you can't go to war with everybody. Right. So it's a very fine line.
Yeah, great point. Zoe, how about you? So you've been raised in the PCA. So I'm wondering if some of the chapters, like, you've never had any kind of experience with some of these more demonstrative, outlandish examples, or have you seen some of that as you've moved about the country a little bit in your life and had some time outside of the country as well? Any connections there with kind of some of the more nefarious stuff?
Well, I've certainly seen the nefarious stuff, just like on YouTube, because I was born in 2001. So YouTube has been around pretty much the entire time I've been able to use it. Mm-hmm. So I've seen these things held up as bad examples, but honestly, I've never been in a church where they've happened. So I'm kind of in the unique position of saying, yeah, that's really bad. What's wrong with the rest of you? But I did go to a Presbyterian church in Uganda, and it's really interesting to me. I was reflecting the other day on some of the cultural differences. Like, I went to a Presbyterian church in Uganda, but in Uganda, they have a certain style of music and worship that's kind of universal across the board. It's not incredibly dissimilar to the African-American Baptist churches that you find in the United States, actually. Africans are very musical. There's usually like a small choir. There's usually multiple instruments. But in that scenario, it's not what it would be if it were in America. So generally, it's not really my style. I think I kind of figured that out. Like, at an early age, I was like, this is a little abrasive to my personality when I'm like sitting in church. There's like a crowd. You have the soprano who really likes attention. I think that's something that happens in all cultures. But I mean, even in the intricacies of like what you do day to day in church life, you'll always have those problems with people that want attention, and it doesn't always come out in the worship service. But I've been very blessed. I've gone to very mild, normal churches pretty much my whole life. Even in Uganda, there was a Presbyterian, I think it was a Westminster East graduate who was our pastor for the longest time in Uganda. So I haven't seen a lot of these things with firsthand experience, but of course I have friends who've seen it. I once visited my friend's younger sister's baptism at a church that was very similar to the churches you describe. And on the back of the seat was this little pocket. And inside the pocket was a business card that says, "Church doesn't suck." And That's very emblematic of what you're saying in your book, is like people want to make it so that people will want to come to church. And I guess the best way to do that is to say the church doesn't suck. But so I think that's, I've seen it, not personally,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I like to see those examples. I think the most recent one that comes to mind is the football Bible being kicked through the
Oh,
goalpost
yes.
on
How
Super Bowl
clever.
Sunday. We're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of that. Can you
Yeah.
believe it?
The kick heard around the world. Now, interesting, because both of your husbands are pastors. I would very much like to know what your worship services are like. There is no standard PCA service that we all have to follow. In fact, in various PCA churches around the nation, you'll find different worship practices, some more liturgical, some more freestyle, some more traditional. There's a little bit of everything. So Zoe, let's just stick with you for a moment. What does your church service look like? If you can, take us through the liturgy or the order of worship as you have it on any common Lord's Day.
So our church service is very similar to probably Sarah's and Sean's and yours, I would imagine. We have a little meditation at the top of our bulletin. Seth comes on stage, or he comes to the pulpit. I guess on stage is kind of a
That's the worshiptainment phrase.
A little too on the nose, if you will. Yeah, it's a little too worshiptainment-y. So don't shoot the messenger, but there is a stage where we meet. He'll do the call to worship. We'll have a psalm. We'll have a hymn. We will have the reading of the law, which is usually fairly short. We'll have a confession, and then we'll have about 4 hymns in the service, and then we'll do. We always have reading of the law, corporate confession, silent confession, promise of God's forgiveness, and then we usually do an assurance. It's not an assurance of faith, but it's a
declaration of faith or something like that.
Something like that. It's usually from that's probably what it is. It's something usually from either the confession or one of the Westminster catechisms. And then we have offering, sermon, communion, benediction.
Got it. Sarah, how about you? Did that resonate pretty well with what you do, or is there any variances there?
No, I think it's about the same. I'm trying to think through the bulletin. I'm the church pianist, so I usually pay attention.
I make the bulletin, and I can't even remember what it's all about.
No, we do call to worship. There's hymn. There's prayer of invocation. We do confession of sin, assurance of pardon. Usually recite either a creed or a catechism question and answer. And then we have, I think it's the offertory, sing doxology. There's the pastoral prayer. There's the New Testament reading, Old Testament reading. There's the sermon. And then another hymn. We have a psalm in the middle of there somewhere. I think it's after. Yeah, there's a song that we sing at least one psalm every week.
Great.
2 hymns.
So do we.
And then, then we have the benediction. So it's very similar to, I think, both of y'all's churches.
Well, I'm so thrilled to hear that you both sing psalms in your church. Now, do you sing them out of the Trinity hymnal, or do you have another psalter that goes along, or do you put them in the bulletin, or how do you do your psalm singing?
We used to have the Book of Psalms for singing. I think that was like the 1970s something. We recently just switched to the Trinity Psalter hymnal, because the psalms in there were set a little bit more musically, with better tunes and pitched a little lower for normal congregations, to make the psalm singing a little bit more accessible and not quite so. Just because you're struggling musically doesn't mean that you're being more holy. So we switched. But a lot of the same stuff. But even then, Sean would still. He has access to several different psalters, and so sometimes if he had a better choice of a tune or something that fit the verses better musically, he would just print out a handout that would just be an insert in the bulletin.
How about you guys, Zoe? Do you have a designated psalter, or do you sing out of the Trinity hymnal, or what do you do for your psalms?
Yeah, so in the Trinity hymnal, there are a couple of psalms already. So Trinity hymnal number 1 is a psalm. Can't remember the names of the other ones. So sometimes the psalms come out of there, but mostly we use the Trinity Psalter, the little red Trinity Psalter. And actually, we've had them donated from a number of churches. Like I think First Scots Presbyterian Church in Beaufort donated some.
Aw.
And yeah, they donated us psalters. And then there is an ARP church. I think it used to be called, they changed their name recently. It's Friend of Sinners Reformed Church, which is an ARP church in way up in the corner of northwestern Washington. But they donated some psalters and hymnals to us. So yeah, we use the Trinity Psalter. It's great. I appreciate that there is no music set to it, so that you can use some of the psalms. You can actually sing to multiple tunes.
Yes, any tune as long as the meter matches. Yep.
Yeah. Which I think is great. I think a lot of the people in our congregation are first time or recent Presbyterians.
Okay.
So my situation, being raised Presbyterian, is very rare. Pretty much nobody. And I think this is probably very common in PCA churches, that people were raised Baptist. They encountered some of the negative sides of evangelical worship that you talk about in your book. Yeah, people usually aren't raised Presbyterian. Setting psalms to familiar hymn tunes is something that really assists our congregation in singing the psalms.
Yes,
and I know
us too.
There are some people who they have an issue with that because the hymn tune belongs to the hymn and the psalms already have psalm tunes. And yeah, that's kind of how I feel about it as well. I'm very pragmatic, because I want people to be able to sing and participate. Like, congregational participation is something that I feel like is sorely lacking as far as the singing goes. I mean, not necessarily in my own church. The people that sing are great, but like just in general, I feel like congregational participation is another one of those ways in which the ordinary means you talk about at the end of the book that we're all very familiar with, the ordinary means of grace. I think the congregational singing as participation in the worship service, I think that's a highly underrated thing. Today. So
yes. By the way, if anyone uses the Trinity hymnal, the PCA OPC Trinity hymnal, there are a ton actually of psalms in there. My only complaint is that they're not really designated in any section of the book. So for instance, the Trinity Psalter hymnal does a better job of delineating which are the psalms and which are the hymns. Whereas in the Trinity hymnal, the OPC PCA one, they're just kind of scattered throughout. So the two ways that you can figure this out is you can either look back in the indexes from whence they have the original sources, because they have drawn from other hymnals and other psalters in the past. And so you could look them up. You could kind of reverse engineer which one is which, or you can look at the bottom of the page, and very often it'll tell you from a certain psalter, or if it's just from Psalm 24 or whatever it is. And then you can kind of figure it out that way. But that would have been nice if they had set out the whole section in the Trinity. They just didn't do that.
There's a PDF document, actually. I ended up doing a huge writing project for Core Christianity. And one of the last things I did was an essay on, look, here's how you actually use your hymn book. Here's how you can switch around tunes and meters and make it work for you. But there was a PDF document that I included that had basically all the psalms in the Trinity hymnal. Their difficulty level is, because some of the ones they have are really familiar, and some of the ones I was like, I have never heard that tune before. That is ridiculous. It's a little off because there's much better versions in other psalters. So that if I could I wonder if I can get that PDF document link up here.
I've seen that floating around. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, it was probably Brad Isbell or PresbyCast on Twitter that tweeted it, because I printed it out and I saved it for myself for a reference. I have an Excel sheet where I track what we sing and why we sing it and things like that. So that was very helpful to me. Now, let me ask you this. And by the way, if you're enjoying this interview, we're actually going to carry this over on the Presby Girls podcast as well. So there's going to be a part 2 of this discussion. Once we wrap up here, we're going to move over to there. So you're going to want to check out that episode as well. Make sure to subscribe to PresbyCast and especially look for those Presby Girls episodes. I wanted to ask you this, since both of your husbands are pastors, do they ever ask for feedback from you about worship? Do they ever, Sarah, you mentioned that you actually play piano, and Zoe, you work up the church bulletin. So that's pretty cool. Do your husbands ask for opinions, feedback, help, hymn selection, anything like that? Or do you just kind of show up on Sunday and here's what it is? Let's start with you, Zoe.
Well, I do make the bulletin. I'm not a musical. I can play guitar a little bit, but nothing more than G, E minor, D, C, that's it. But I do make the church bulletin. Usually Seth sometimes he will ask me like, what hymn do you think would fit best for this? So we've been going through Genesis, and obviously we're looking for hymns that either specifically mention something like God's sovereignty, his plan of redemption a lot of the time after the sermon. And a lot of hymns specifically mention the Genesis narrative. Right now we're in the story of Joseph. So Genesis 41, 42. So sometimes he'll ask me like, can you think of a hymn that talks about, Christ's kingship or whatever? And so sometimes I'll just go thumbing through the indexes and see what I can find, but he mostly puts it together himself. And sometimes we don't be too upset, but sometimes we do sing like some of the Getty hymns, and
no, I like the
them.
Gettys. The Gettys are great. If you start moving into the Elevation or Hillsong, we'll have some differences, or Bethel or whatever. But the Gettys are cool. I like the Gettys.
The Gettys are pretty cool. I promise you, I exist to prevent anything like that from ever happening at our church. But like Seth, I obviously he would never do that. But like sometimes we'll have a Getty hymn, and I will actually physically put the lyrics inside the bulletin instead of having a handout. I think it's just more convenient to have one piece of paper to hold on to during a worship service.
I totally agree. Yeah.
He usually does most of it himself. Like, if he's kind of stuck on something, he'll ask me to look through it. But usually he resolves his problems. Like, he's pretty smart. He usually figures it out before I can come up with a better thing. But yeah, the formatting of the bulletin is done by me. There was actually a really funny moment at one of our earliest worship services where I had forgotten to switch the answer to the new catechism question for the week. And so the question was, what is the fifth commandment? And the answer was, sanctification is
yes.
People were kind of laughing as they were saying it. So I've had my I've had a fair amount of humbling moments doing the bulletin. But
well, I've got a better one for you. I mean, that's pretty good. But one time, going back way back, this is like 20 years ago, my pastor had just done a wedding, and the girl's name was Jessica. But the previous wedding that he did was Mary. And so he did a search and replace, and he switched out Mary for Jessica for the wedding. I don't know how, and I don't know why, but somehow that search term got also changed in the church bulletin. So when we said the Apostles' Creed, we all confessed our faith in the Virgin Jessica, which was the all-time worst search and replace error I've ever seen.
Amazing.
Yeah, the Virgin Jessica. Born of the Virgin Jessica.
Oh, that's too good.
True story. I don't know how that happened. That's like a major cut and paste error right there, but that is true.
That wins the, even the Message version. I don't think it's even gone that far. Wow.
Yeah, that is pretty bad.
That's amazing.
Sarah, wrapping up here in just a couple of minutes, but how about you and your husband? Does he incorporate your insights and your help in any of the worship preparations?
Not really. Sean can do the whole thing neat and tidy and wonderfully. The only time that he usually asks for my opinion, and the only time he needs my opinion, is if it's more technically musical. So sometimes we've run into, I'm like, okay, so you put this sheet music in the insert, but it's just slightly different because for some reason the RPCNA decided to just slightly adjust the tune to Stuttgart and do the rhythm wrong, or like in the New Trinity Psalter hymnal, How Firm a Foundation, the melody is slightly off. Okay. Our congregation is used to singing it, it's just like little things like that. And so, before we had the Psalter hymnal, he'd be like, we're going to do this psalm. And I'm like, is it okay if I transcribe this down like a step and a half? Okay, it's in F. Can I do it in D? Can I do it in E flat? And he's like, yeah, we need to do this. And he gives me kind of free reign to go a cappella whenever I want, which is a lot because our congregation sings really well. So as much as I can let them go, and sometimes in the morning I can hear them and I'm like, okay, guys, this is the first hymn. Y'all haven't had your coffee yet. Like, wake up. But usually by the psalm and by the third hymn, they're alive and just about blowing out the roof of the building, which I don't think I've ever heard a congregation sing as well as our congregation. It is just majestic. It's awesome. Yeah,
that's awesome.
So I don't really have that much of a job. I'm the accompanist. And when you have a congregation that sings that well, your job is pretty much moot and you ought to just get out of the way as much as possible. That's my opinion.
That is so great. I'm an adjunct professor at RPTS, the Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary, which is associated with the RPCNA. It's their official denominational seminary. And so I get to go to Covenanter or a exclusive psalm services quite a bit in chapel, and then also conferences and other churches that I have connections with. And I'll tell you what, man, those Covenanter psalm singers are the best. They
I bet
sing
it sounds
in,
amazing.
it is amazing. They sing in multiple parts, and because there's no instrumentation, no piano, no organ, they just declare it. And they're all like choirs. They're all like professional choirs. It's really, really amazing. And so if you ever have a chance to go to an RP exclusive psalmody service, you should definitely take that up. Have you ever experienced exclusive psalmody before? Have you heard that?
One of my best friends in college was RPCNA, and so I went home with her on spring, fall break several times and went to her church, and was just like, what, kind of what is happening, but very unfamiliar. But it was still like, okay, there's lots of people singing in parts, and we don't have any music. And, some of the ones they did better than others, but still,
Okay.
I'm
Yep.
thinking
Yep.
most congregations would not have been able to pull this off.
Yeah. Pretty cool. Pretty cool. Well, listen, thank you so much for coming on today to talk about Worshiptainment. Let me just throw out a couple of recommendations. First of all, Zoe is going to be doing a review of the book for the Aquila Report, which is a fantastic website. It keeps you up to date on all kinds of things related to the PCA, the OPC, the RPCNA, the EPC, other Presbyterian denominations. So check out that article over there. Also, make sure you subscribe to PresbyCast, and especially look for those Presby Girls episodes. Hopefully you guys can keep them coming out on the regular, because they're really fun. And I really appreciate the fact that you guys have a unique voice and lots of laughs, lots of humor together, profound insights as well. So make sure to check that out. I want to thank everyone for checking into this video today. Thank you so much. I love y'all lots, and we'll talk to you later.